Hey guys, tonight we're going to dive into something a little different. The world's first books. Yeah, I know what you're thinking. Books have been around forever, right? But what did the first books really look like? And more importantly, what did they sound like? Imagine yourself standing in a bustling ancient city. Your eyes are straining to read the script, but you're hearing something that's not quite what you'd expect. Maybe it's the faint rustling of a papyrus scroll or the deep scratching of a stylus on clay. You probably won't survive this journey unless you're ready to travel back in time, where paper and ink were still in their infancy, and the sounds of writing were just as important as the words themselves. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Oh, and don't forget to post your location and the time. It's always fascinating to see where these stories reach. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start at the very beginning, when the concept of a book was nothing more than a faint glimmer on the horizon. Imagine this. Early humans, long before the first physical books, used simple tools to mark symbols on clay, stone, or bone. These were the first steps toward writing, but it wasn't quite a book as we know it. Instead, these early forms of communication were more like a bridge between thought and language. Simple records of important information or rituals. The first books didn't come until much later. Writing itself wasn't something that just happened. It had to be invented, developed, and refined over thousands of years. The earliest form of writing we can trace back to is the Sumerian script, which arose around 3500 BCE in Mesopotamia. But here's the kicker. Before writing became widespread and easily accessible, it was highly specialized. Only certain people, like scribes or priests, had the knowledge and skill to inscribe symbols or words, and the majority of these early books were either created on clay tablets or other materials that were far from what we imagine as a book today. Historians still argue whether the first book truly existed in any format recognizable to us, or if writing at this time was considered more of a sacred functional record, less a book, and more of a necessary tool to document things like trade, legal agreements, or religious rituals. It was only later that the idea of bound, readable works would take shape. Imagine you're standing in the dusty streets of ancient Mesopotamia. The sun is beating down on you as you watch the scribes, the learned few, as they sit hunched over their clay tablets, carefully etching cuneiform characters into the soft clay. This is where it all begins. The very first known form of writing, the cuneiform script, was created around 3500 BCE. By the Sumerians in the region we now call Iraq. They didn't have ink or parchment. What they used instead was a reed stylus, which they pressed into soft clay to create wedge-shaped marks. Each mark was a symbol, a piece of a puzzle that made up their written language. Now, before we get carried away thinking that the Sumerians were just sitting around scribbling away all day, it's important to realize that this early form of writing wasn't for novels or tales of adventure. No, this was about accounting, trade, and recording laws. The scribes were the high-status individuals, and the work they did was critical for the functioning of the city-states. They needed to keep track of everything: the amount of grain in storage, the number of livestock, trade agreements, and even debts. If you wanted to get a piece of land, you needed a record of the transaction to prove ownership, and that's where cuneiform came in. But as the need for communication grew, so did the complexity of the writing system. You may be wondering, what did it sound like when a scribe wrote? Well, picture this. The sound of the stylus scratching across clay, a rhythmic scraping that filled the air as the scribe worked. The clay was soft at first, but as the hours wore on, the stylus would carve deeper into the surface, leaving behind more pronounced etched marks. The sounds of these early written records were tactile, almost like a slow, deliberate form of reading with your hands. Historians still argue whether cuneiform was meant to be read aloud, or whether it was a more private, silent form of communication. The written records were often intended for later reference, not necessarily public performance. But you can imagine that in certain contexts, like reading sacred texts or legal decrees, the scribe would recite the words aloud, adding a layer of vocal rhythm to the otherwise silent process. The ancient Sumerians didn't just use cuneiform for basic record keeping. Eventually they began using it to write stories too. One of the most famous pieces of literature in the world, the Epic of Gilgamesh, was recorded using this very script. As you listen to the gentle scratch of the reed stylus on clay, imagine the stories it began to record, the legends of gods, kings, and epic adventures. The sound of cuneiform writing wasn't just functional anymore, it was becoming something more profound. The birth of storytelling through writing. Historians still debate whether these stories, passed down through the ages, were meant to be read aloud by an audience, or if they were simply private stories, meant to be pondered by the reader alone. But back to the tablets for a moment. To truly understand the weight of what these scribes were creating, we need to remember that this was a huge step forward. The ability to record and preserve stories in a permanent form was revolutionary. Before this, human history was only passed down orally, told by storytellers around campfires or in royal courts. With the advent of cuneiform, stories could be preserved for future generations, not just through memory, but in a form that could be physically held, touched, and read over and over again. In essence, the first books were born not from parchment or leather, but from clay, and the sound of writing these early stories was, in a sense, the sound of history taking shape. As you step further into the world of ancient civilizations, you find yourself in the warm, dry landscapes of ancient Egypt, where the Sumerians' clay tablets are slowly being replaced by something a little more flexible: papyrus. This discovery, one of Egypt's greatest gifts to the world, would revolutionize how people wrote, stored, and read information. You can almost hear the rustling of papyrus in the air. Smooth, pliable sheets that could be rolled up like scrolls or stacked to form the earliest books. Imagine that sound now, the delicate crinkle of the papyrus as it unfurls, revealing the inked symbols of Egyptian hieroglyphs. Papyrus was made from the stalk of the papyrus plant, which grew along the banks of the Nile. The Egyptians would cut the stalks into strips, layer them, and press them together, creating a surface on which to write. The process of making papyrus was both an art and a science. It was labour-intensive, but the result was an incredibly durable material that was perfect for writing. But papyrus was more than just practical. It was a symbol of Egypt's advanced culture. The Egyptians used it not only for everyday transactions, but for religious texts, poetry, medical treatises, and much more. The sound of the stylus or reed pen gliding across this surface would be more fluid than the scraping of cuneiform on clay, more like a smooth, deliberate flow of ink marking symbols that were both beautiful and functional. When you think of the earliest books, you might picture something akin to the scrolls that Egyptian scribes meticulously produced. These scrolls weren't just for keeping records, they were used to preserve stories of the gods, kings, and pharaohs. The famous Book of the Dead, an Egyptian funerary text, was written on papyrus and intended to guide the soul of the deceased through the afterlife. Imagine the sound of a scribe's brush as they carefully traced hieroglyphs onto a long, unrolling sheet of papyrus. Each stroke of the brush was a prayer, a hope for immortality. When you hear this in your mind, the rhythm of it feels meditative, almost sacred. Historians still argue whether these texts were primarily read aloud during ceremonies or whether they were intended for private reflection. Given the significance of these texts, it's likely they were shared aloud in temples or royal courts, with the soft hum of the scribe's voice rising from the papyrus, reciting the words of the gods in a rhythm that echoed through the chambers. But the hieroglyphs themselves, those intricate symbolic characters, were not just a form of writing. They were also an art form, a visual language that told stories with images as much as with letters. Some historians debate whether these symbols were meant to be understood solely as a form of written language, or whether they were also intended to be experienced as artwork. The way the glyphs interacted with the material of the papyrus itself, and the way they were arranged on the scroll, made the reading experience a dynamic interaction between the text and the reader. The sound of the papyrus being unrolled, combined with the rhythmic brushstrokes, created a kind of spoken poetry that could be both an auditory and visual experience. But papyrus, while revolutionary, wasn't the end-all for ancient writing. The Egyptians had a long history of recorded texts, but the shift to papyrus opened the door for an even larger scale spread of written knowledge. The use of papyrus in Egypt and other parts of the ancient world would eventually lead to the rise of larger libraries, where the sound of scrolls being unfurled became the auditory backdrop to the exchange of knowledge. These scrolls would go on to influence the development of books throughout the Mediterranean world, eventually paving the way for more portable and accessible forms of written knowledge. So as you stand amidst the papyrus scrolls of Egypt, you can almost hear the rustling of history unfolding. The sound of those early books, made from plant fibres, painstakingly inscribed by skilled scribes, is a sound that links us to the very beginnings of written culture. The papyrus scroll carrying the knowledge of the gods and kings was an important turning point in the evolution of books. It was the moment when writing shifted from mere record-keeping to something that could be held, read, and passed on, something that would live far beyond the moment it was written. It may not have looked like the books we know today, but in the scrolls of ancient Egypt, you can hear the echoes of the literary world as we understand it now. Let's step away from Egypt for a moment and enter the world of oral tradition, something so ingrained in early human societies that the concept of a book was barely a whisper on the horizon. Long before papyrus, clay, or even ink, humans relied on memory and spoken word to preserve history, culture, and knowledge. Imagine the crackling firelight of an ancient camp, or the warm glow of torches in a royal court, as storytellers weave tales of gods and heroes, kings and queens. These were the foundations upon which the first books would later be built. You can almost hear the cadence of the voices, slow, rhythmic, drawing the audience into the world of myth and legend. Oral tradition was far more than just a method of communication. It was a vital part of the very fabric of society. Stories were passed down through generations, not on paper or papyrus, but in the hearts and minds of those who recited them. In many ancient cultures, particularly in Africa, the Americas and Asia, oral storytelling was the primary way of transmitting knowledge. Everything from creation myths to genealogies, from war strategies to medical remedies. These stories were not static. They were living entities, ever evolving, changing with each telling. Every word, every pause, every inflection carried meaning, and often the performance of these stories was just as important as the words themselves. Historians still argue about the precise role oral tradition played in early human societies. Some claim it was merely a tool for passing down information, while others suggest that it was a form of art, central to shaping cultural identity. Take the ancient Greeks, for example. Long before they wrote down Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, these epic tales were sung by bards, passed on through the generations. It's fascinating to think that, for centuries, Homer's stories were not bound in books, but existed only in the rhythm of recitation, heard by audiences in the same way a modern listener might enjoy a spoken word performance or an audiobook. There was an intimacy in that, wasn't there? A connection not just to the words themselves, but to the person telling them, to the performance that brought those words to life. The very sound of the words, the inflections, the pauses, the emphasis, everything was designed to evoke emotions, to stir the hearts of listeners. It was a far cry from the silent, solitary reading we experience today. The sounds of early books, then, were deeply tied to their context. The rhythm of the words, the deliberate pacing of the storyteller were just as important as the content of the story. And let's not forget the audience. Books in this form weren't meant to be read alone in quiet solitude. They were meant to be heard, to be shared. People gathered in groups, listening intently, reacting to the story in real time, often interrupting with questions or exclamations. It wasn't just about the words themselves, but about the shared experience of the narrative. As you listen to these ancient stories, you realize that the very sound of the storyteller's voice, the way they modulated their tones, stretched vowels, or softened consonants, was designed to create an emotional connection. This kind of storytelling required both performer and audience to be deeply attuned to one another. It wasn't passive, it was interactive, alive, breathing. In many ways, oral traditions were the first books in their truest sense. The performance of these stories, whether through song, speech, or chant, was how knowledge was transferred from one generation to the next. You can imagine the voice of the elder, steady and powerful, weaving the history of their people into the fabric of time. And just like the books we know today, these stories were valuable, sacred even. They told the history of a people's existence, their trials and triumphs, their deepest fears and highest hopes. In that sense, they were no less powerful than a written text. In fact, you could argue they were even more powerful, because they were dynamic, constantly evolving, never confined to the rigidity of ink on paper. Historians are still divided on whether oral traditions were more reliable or more prone to embellishment than written texts. Some suggest that the oral transmission of knowledge was a more authentic way of sharing history, because it was passed on in real time, shaped by living memory. Others argue that over time these stories inevitably morphed, losing their original meaning or becoming exaggerated as they were passed from mouth to mouth. But one thing is clear, the sounds of early oral books were meant to be heard and felt. They were not simply containers of knowledge, they were experiences in themselves, a sensory feast for the listener. The art of storytelling was just as vital to early civilizations as the written word would become. You can almost hear the echoes of these ancient storytellers now, the soft hum of the crowd, the voice of the narrator rising and falling, wrapping the listeners in a world of adventure, mystery and wonder. This was the first true form of books, the first real experience of knowledge being shared, not in silence, but in sound. And though written books would soon come into being, the very essence of storytelling remained the same. The rhythm, the tone, the pace. The sounds of the first books were not words on a page, but living, breathing stories told aloud. Now let's turn the page of history and step into the ancient world of Mesopotamia once again, but this time we're not looking at cuneiform or papyrus. No, we're delving into something much bigger, the world's first known library. Imagine yourself in the heart of the ancient city of Nineveh, standing before the great library of Ashurbanipal, the king who built it in the 7th century BCE. The air is thick with dust, but there's an undeniable hum of intellectual activity. In front of you is the grand collection of clay tablets and scrolls, thousands upon thousands of them, meticulously preserved in the royal archives of Assyria. The sound of scribes murmurs through the halls, copying texts, recording the history of the world, of battles, kings and gods. But what does a library sound like? The library of Ashurbanipal wasn't a library as we know it today, filled with rows of neatly bound books and the occasional shh from a librarian. No, these were the earliest forms of books contained on clay tablets that were inscribed with cuneiform, the ancient script of Mesopotamia. The tablets were stored in wooden or clay boxes, organised into different sections. Religious texts, royal decrees, legal codes, epic stories, and scientific knowledge. You can imagine the rustling of parchment scrolls, the faint scratch of a stylus inscribing the soft clay, and the occasional sound of someone unrolling a scroll to read aloud. Now let's be clear. Libraries weren't just about books for reading in ancient times. No, libraries were places of power. They were stores of knowledge that represented a king's control over not just the written word, but the history and future of their civilization. When King Ashurbanipal commissioned the creation of this vast library, he wasn't just collecting books for intellectual pleasure, he was collecting them for political influence. The written word in his time wasn't something meant to be quietly absorbed by an individual reader, but rather something used to solidify authority, declare divine favour, and legitimize rule. Picture yourself walking through this ancient library, the sounds echoing off the stone walls as you make your way past rows of tablets. The scribes are busy at work, copying texts from one tablet to another. Every so often, you hear a voice, loud, clear, and powerful, reciting one of the epic stories that were housed in the library, perhaps the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest pieces of literature ever written, echoes in the halls, bringing the ancient words of gods and heroes to life in a way that transcends the physicality of the tablets. These were not just books to be read in solitude. They were to be heard, performed, and passed on to others. The library was a place of learning, yes, but it was also a centre of social and political life. It wasn't just scholars who used the library. It was kings, generals, priests, and diplomats. Ashurbanipal himself, one of the last great kings of Assyria, was a patron of knowledge. Historians still debate whether the Library of Ashurbanipal was the first true public library in the world, as it was likely open to various members of society who had the means and power to access it. Scholars, diplomats, and priests would have come from all corners of the empire to peruse the knowledge contained within the walls of the library, to seek divine guidance, legal counsel, or even strategic advice for battle. The sounds of the library were likely quite different from those we hear in a modern setting. There would have been no soft whispers of people browsing through pages, no quiet turning of pages. No, the sounds would have been filled with the clatter of writing instruments, the rustling of scrolls, and the booming voices of those reciting epic tales or decrees. The very sound of the library itself was a form of communication, a way of passing knowledge down through generations. But the most remarkable thing about this early library is that it was one of the first places where the written word was treated not just as a tool of bureaucracy, but as a work of art. The texts in the library of Ashurbanipal were not just practical, they were valuable cultural treasures. Some of these ancient tablets contained poems, scientific treatises, and even stories of mythical battles. There was an entire section of the library dedicated to medical texts, a fascinating look at how ancient civilizations understood disease and healing. The library wasn't just a place to store records, it was a place where knowledge was revered and passed on, stored for future generations who could use it, build upon it, or perhaps even rewrite it. Historians still argue whether the contents of the library of Ashurbanipal were ever fully used, or whether they were simply symbols of royal power. Were they meant to be accessed regularly, or were they more of a symbolic collection, intended to show the king's wisdom and divine favour? Did Ashurbanipal use the knowledge in his library to rule more effectively, or was the library simply a monument to his own greatness? These are the questions that still linger, and like the echoes in the halls of the library, they remain unanswered. But one thing is certain, the library of Ashurbanipal was one of the earliest attempts to collect and preserve knowledge for future generations. Let's now take a moment to step out of the ancient Middle Eastern world and into the bustling marketplaces of ancient Greece, where scrolls are unrolling, papyrus rustling, and the first real written literature is beginning to take shape. Greece was the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, and much of the intellectual foundation of the Western world, but it was also home to something equally revolutionary, the Greek scrolls, which laid the groundwork for books as we know them. But what exactly did these scrolls sound like when they were first read? Imagine the subtle, almost hypnotic rhythm of a reader unrolling a scroll, the whispering of papyrus as it's carefully unfurled, and the soft, deliberate scratching of a reed pen as scribes recorded the epic works of their greatest poets. The scrolls themselves were long, rolled-up sheets of papyrus, and unlike the static, bound books we're used to, these were read out loud by public readers or by individuals in their homes. It's easy to imagine the solemnity of these early readings, as the epic tales of heroes like Homer's Iliad and Odyssey filled the air, their rhythmic verse ringing out over the city. Picture the sounds of the public readings in Athens, crowds gathered in open-air theatres, eager to hear the latest works of philosophy, drama, or poetry. The Greeks loved to hear their stories, their philosophies, and their debates spoken aloud. The idea of reading silently was a foreign one to them. Every word, every phrase was meant to be shared, to be passed between minds in the air rather than just silently absorbed. You can almost hear the difference between an ancient Greek scroll and the written works of earlier civilizations. While the Sumerians' cuneiform or the Egyptians' papyrus were used for record-keeping or administrative purposes, Greek scrolls were dedicated to literature, drama, and intellectual thought. These scrolls, often handwritten in elegant flowing scripts, were carefully crafted for the purpose of communicating ideas, stories, and knowledge. The sounds of these scrolls would have been quite different too, less the scratch of a stylus on clay, and more the ink flowing on the smooth surface of papyrus, accompanied by the sound of the reader's voice bringing the written words to life. The idea of performance was central to the Greek experience of books, especially the epic works. Imagine a Greek public reading, someone unrolling a scroll with a practiced hand and with a voice that fluctuates in tone and rhythm to give life to the words. As the story of Achilles' wrath or Odysseus' journey across the seas is recited, the audience would have been drawn into the world of the story, listening intently, hanging on every word, as if the story itself were unfolding right before their eyes. The recitations might have been accompanied by gestures, the voice rising in excitement during battle scenes, or lowering in solemnity during moments of reflection. The voice itself became an instrument of storytelling, creating an auditory landscape that allowed listeners to travel with the characters through time and space. The scrolls weren't just reserved for grand stories, they were also used for the philosophical writings of thinkers like Plato and Aristotle, whose works were read aloud in academic circles, discussed and debated in public forums. Imagine the sound of a scroll being opened in the academy or lyceum, and the voice of a philosopher filling the air with discussions about the nature of reality, ethics, or the state. These public readings weren't just about the content. They were an integral part of intellectual life. They were a way of transmitting ideas, stimulating minds, and engaging the citizens in debates that would shape the future of Western civilization. Historians still debate whether the earliest books in Greece were more likely to be private, personal scrolls, or if the public recitation of scrolls played a larger role in Greek society. Some believe the scrolls were intended to be read by individuals alone, while others suggest that the true power of these early texts was in their public presentation. The public readings of Homer, for instance, were as much about the communal experience of hearing these stories as they were about the stories themselves. The scroll was a medium through which people could come together, share in a collective experience, and engage with the world's great narratives. And here's something you might not have realized. In many ways, these early Greek scrolls set the stage for the creation of the book as we know it. While we often think of books as a modern invention, the Greek scrolls were an essential first step in that evolution. The portability of the scrolls, their ability to be unrolled, read aloud, and passed from person to person, laid the groundwork for the later development of bound codices, the precursor to the modern book. The idea of a written, portable narrative that could be shared among individuals was taking shape here, in the world of scrolls, in the bustling markets of Athens, and in the great libraries that began to sprout up throughout the Greek world. Imagine, then, the legacy of those early Greek scrolls. Not just the sound of the words as they were spoken aloud, but the intellectual culture they fostered, the communal connection they created between people, and the stories of gods and men. These early scrolls, read aloud with emotion, passion, and deliberation, weren't just about words on a surface. They were about the shared human experience. In the sounds of the reader's voice, in the collective focus of the audience, in the rhythmic flow of ink on papyrus, the first books were born, not in silence, but in a vibrant living dialogue that connected people across time and space. The story of the world's first books is far from finished, and we're about to embark on a journey through time that takes us to the sacred land of Mesopotamia once more. But this time, we're not dealing with just a written record or a scroll. No, we're dealing with the grandest piece of literature that's still in existence, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Consider this. You've just entered the halls of an ancient Babylonian palace. You're surrounded by towering stone walls covered in carvings of kings, gods, and mythical beasts. And there, among the royal scribes, is the world's first known literary work, recorded in cuneiform on clay tablets. The Epic of Gilgamesh is not merely a story. It's a piece of humanity's soul etched into stone. It's a literary masterpiece, and perhaps even more astonishing is that we still read it today, thousands of years later. Now imagine what it must have been like for the first people to hear this epic recited. There's no book in front of you, no page to turn, only the voice of a narrator, rising and falling, bringing Gilgamesh's heroic exploits to life. Can you hear it? The sound of the reciter's voice vibrating through the palace chambers, their words echoing off the walls. You can imagine the audience gathered in rapt attention, leaning in as they hear the familiar rhythm of a mythic tale, the clash between the divine and the mortal, the pursuit of immortality, the loss of loved ones. The words aren't just read, they're performed. The sound of the scribe's voice, amplified by the grandeur of the setting, turns the written word into an event, a shared experience that reverberates through both time and space. In the ancient world, books weren't solitary experiences. They weren't something to be read quietly in the corner of your room, as many of us do today. Instead, they were performed, recited, and shared aloud. The Epic of Gilgamesh was no exception. As it travelled through the generations, it was passed down not in silence, but in vibrant communal recitations. You can almost hear the rhythm of it now, the rise and fall of the reciter's voice, mimicking the ebb and flow of Gilgamesh's journey. His quest for immortality, his friendship with Enkidu, his heartbreaking journey through grief after the death of his companion. Historians still argue whether the Epic of Gilgamesh was originally a single work, or whether it was an accumulation of multiple stories and songs told by different bards over time. Some suggest it was created by several poets, each adding layers to the tale until it became a cohesive narrative. But one thing is certain, the Epic of Gilgamesh was not just a work of literature, it was a cultural artifact. It was a vehicle for preserving the history, values, and beliefs of a society. The ancient Sumerians and Babylonians were passing on more than just a story. They were passing on their understanding of life, death, the gods, and the afterlife. The epic was a reflection of the human condition, one that transcended its time and place. The Epic of Gilgamesh wasn't the first story ever told, but it was the first to be recorded in such a monumental way. You could almost say it was the first book, albeit in a very different form. As it was inscribed on clay tablets, it became something that could be preserved, passed on, and eventually discovered thousands of years later by modern scholars. Can you imagine the awe felt by the archaeologists who unearthed the tablets of Gilgamesh in the 19th century? To read the words of a civilization that had long since crumbled, and to hear the voice of Gilgamesh himself, even though he lived in a world so far removed from ours, it's a humbling experience. The sound of Gilgamesh's voice, as it would have been recited by the scribes of old, continues to echo in our minds today. The story of Gilgamesh is not just one of ancient kings and gods. It's a story about the search for meaning, the inevitability of death, and the relationships that define our humanity. The Epic of Gilgamesh was not meant to be a static, silent record of events. It was a living, breathing story that demanded to be heard. The sound of the reciter's voice, speaking of love, loss, and immortality, was as much a part of the story as the words themselves. As you sit in the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia, imagining the sounds of Gilgamesh's tale being recited, you realize that this early form of storytelling was far more dynamic than we often give it credit for. The first books may not have had the traditional form we associate with them today, but they were no less powerful. The Epic of Gilgamesh was a performance, an experience that involved not just the written word, but the voice, the rhythm, and the shared emotions of the audience. The sound of those first books is not just the rustling of papyrus or the scratching of a stylus, it's the living, breathing experience of humanity speaking to itself, trying to make sense of the world, of life and death, of gods and men. The Epic of Gilgamesh didn't just survive the ravages of time, it evolved, adapted, and transformed, from a spoken performance to written form, and finally into the printed page that we have access to today. And as you sit in this moment, you can almost hear the ancient voice rising from the clay tablets, telling you the story of Gilgamesh and his search for immortality. The first books weren't just about the written word. They were about the sounds of the stories, the voices that gave them life. The sound of Gilgamesh's quest for understanding, for friendship, and for meaning echoes through the centuries, reminding us that the true power of a book lies not just in the words it contains, but in the way it is shared, heard, and experienced. Let's travel forward in time, crossing the vast Mediterranean and heading toward ancient Rome. The air is alive with the bustle of the city, merchants shouting in the market, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, and if you listen closely, the distinct sound of parchment rustling as scrolls are unrolled in the forums, temples, and libraries. We're in the heart of the Roman Empire, a place where written works weren't just the domain of scholars or kings. They were vital to the very functioning of Roman society. Imagine walking through the narrow, cobbled streets of ancient Rome, the sounds of distant conversations in Latin filling the air, and coming across a grand library, perhaps the Library of Alexandria, where Roman citizens were learning, reading, and discussing ideas that would shape the future of the Western world. Roman books weren't quite books in the way we know them today, but they were still incredibly important. Picture scrolls, similar to the ones in Greece, but now crafted from parchment instead of papyrus, which was becoming more common in Rome. The sound of a parchment scroll unfurling is sharp and distinct, no more of the soft crinkling of papyrus, but a sound that carries a little more weight, a little more permanence. Imagine sitting in the Grand Library of Rome, listening as a scroll is read aloud by a learned scholar. This wasn't just a text for private study, it was an intellectual experience shared by many. The voices of orators and philosophers would echo through the marble halls, discussing the great works of the day, like those of Cicero, Virgil, and Ovid. What made Roman books so interesting was the combination of practical and intellectual writing. For example, legal texts were transcribed onto parchment for government use, preserving laws and records for posterity. These legal scrolls weren't just for the courts, they were the foundation for how Roman society governed itself. The 12 Tables, the foundation of Roman law, would have been inscribed on tablets, read aloud by judges in public settings so that the law could be understood by all. Imagine hearing a judge reading from a scroll in the town square, the words crisp and authoritative as they declared what was and was not allowed in the city. Even legal texts, then, were meant to be heard and felt in the same way the great works of literature were. The same principles applied to military records or political decrees. These weren't just written for documentation, they were meant to resonate, to reach the people in ways that mere written records alone never could. The the Roman use of scrolls extended well beyond government and law. The stories of Rome, its heroes, and its gods were recorded for the first time in the Aeneid and other epic poems. These were works not just meant to be read privately, but to be shared aloud, giving voice to the values and ideals of the Roman people. Imagine a great banquet hall, the sounds of wine goblets clinking, guests gathered around a scholar as he unrolls a scroll and begins reading from Virgil's Aeneid, recounting the legendary journey of Aeneas, the Trojan hero, destined to found Rome. The rhythm of Virgil's verse, the rise and fall of the language would have filled the room. The audience wouldn't just be passively absorbing the story, they would be hearing it, engaging with it, experiencing it collectively. In fact, the word book itself didn't even apply in the Roman world the way it does today. Books were, for the most part, scrolls, carefully handwritten on parchment or papyrus. The concept of a book, as we think of it, bound with pages you can turn in solitude, hadn't yet fully emerged. The sound of Roman books, then, wasn't the solitary sound of pages turning, it was the sound of community, of shared knowledge, and public performance. The Romans were also pioneers in the use of codices, or bound books, but their real intellectual power came in the public forums, where orators would read from scrolls, where literature and law were discussed out loud for the benefit of all. You could almost hear the soft murmur of conversation in the background as scrolls were passed from hand to hand, or the click of a wooden ink block being used to stamp copies of legal texts. When a scholar or writer would stand before an audience in ancient Rome, the words on the scroll would come to life, filling the space around them. The written word became something that was experienced, not just by the individual, but by the entire Roman community. And then there were the libraries of Rome, grand repositories of knowledge, where scrolls were carefully stored and catalogued, ready to be read by anyone who sought the wisdom they contained. These libraries were early versions of the public library, where anyone from the elite senators to curious commoners could read the works of the great philosophers, poets, and historians. The sounds in these libraries were likely not silent. The occasional rustle of parchment or papyrus, the soft murmur of readers discussing a passage, or the sound of a reader's voice as they read aloud from a scroll to themselves. These were all part of the auditory landscape of Roman intellectual life. Historians still debate whether the Romans ever fully transitioned to bound codices on a large scale during their time, as the codex didn't truly replace the scroll until later, during the Middle Ages. Some argue that the codex, something we now consider a book in its modern form, was introduced primarily for convenience and portability, especially as Christianity spread and early Christian texts were written down in this form. Others argue that the scroll, with its grandeur and ability to be read aloud in public forums, was much more suited to the Roman public. But one thing is certain, the transition from the scroll to the codex was as much about the change in how knowledge was consumed as it was about a shift in the sounds of the written word. The soundscape of the Roman scroll, then, is deeply embedded in the culture of shared intellectual and public experience. The words of the great poets, philosophers, and orators didn't just live on parchment. They lived in the voices of those who read them aloud, in the ears of those who listened, and in the minds of those who engaged with the works. And in that, you can hear the early seeds of what we now recognise as the book, an artefact not just for personal reading, but for collective memory, for cultural preservation, and for the power of the spoken and written word to unite people across time and space. Now that we've explored the grand scrolls of Greece and Rome, let's take a monumental leap forward into a transformative moment in the history of books, when papyrus and parchment began to take a back seat to the evolution of new materials, parchment and vellum. These new materials weren't just more durable, they were the gateway to something more flexible and portable, creating the first true books in the sense we know them today. This innovation would lay the foundation for what we now recognise as the modern codex, the first book made from pages, bound together and ready to be flipped through. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Picture the scene. You're sitting in an early medieval scriptorium, somewhere in Europe during the 6th or 7th century. The air smells of ink and parchment, and there's the constant scratch of quills dipping into ink pots. The scene is quiet, focused. The monks or scribes are bent over their work, copying religious texts, legal codes, and literary works. The sound of a quill scratching against parchment is soft, rhythmic, almost like the sound of a brush in the hands of a painter, each movement deliberate, each stroke with purpose. The binding of these early books is simple but effective. The pages are sewn together one by one, creating the earliest version of a codex, a book where you could actually turn the pages instead of unrolling a scroll. The difference in sound is subtle but profound. The scroll's long, rolling movement was replaced by a new, more fluid motion. Instead of the sound of papyrus rustling or the sharp scratch of a stylus on clay, we hear the soft turn of parchment pages and the quiet dip of a quill as it creates words that, for the first time in history, could be easily bound together. What we might take for granted today, the fact that we can open a book and read through it, from cover to cover, is something that began to take shape in these early manuscripts. As these early books were made from parchment, a material far more flexible than clay tablets or papyrus, the process of making them was both intricate and painstaking. To prepare the parchment, animal skins, often sheep or goats, were carefully scraped and stretched to create a smooth surface. This was time-consuming work, but the results were durable, allowing books to last for centuries. The sound of parchment when it's turned over has a certain crispness to it, almost like the rustling of leaves in a breeze. These sounds would have been a stark contrast to the older methods of recording knowledge on stone or clay. Now, knowledge could be carried around, transported easily, and for the first time could be read in privacy without needing a public performance. But the creation of these early medieval books wasn't just a matter of materials. With the introduction of the codex came an entirely new way of organising and thinking about written texts. In a scroll, the reader would be confined to a single, continuous text. But with a codex, multiple sections of text could be contained in one book. You could easily flip from one page to another, referencing different parts of a text without having to unroll or re-roll anything. This structural shift would change the way people thought about books and knowledge. The codex made reading more efficient, and it laid the groundwork for future innovations, like the index and table of contents. At the same time, this was also the age of the illuminated manuscript. Picture the delicate artistry that went into each book, pages carefully decorated with vibrant colours, intricate designs, and often gold leaf. This wasn't just a book, it was an artifact of devotion. The scribes didn't merely write the words, they made the words come to life with colour and design. The process was highly time-consuming, as the ink had to be prepared, and the illustrations needed to be carefully drawn and painted, often by hand. The sounds of the scriptorium would have included not just the scratching of quills, but the light tapping of brushes on vellum, creating intricate designs to accompany the text. The monks were not just scribes, they were artists, turning these early books into pieces of spiritual devotion, art, and learning. Imagine walking into one of these early scriptoria and seeing a monk carefully painting a Bible page, the fine lines of gold and red beginning to come to life under his steady hand. The sound would be faint, perhaps a whisper of movement, a brush stroke here or there, but the impact of the book itself would have been enormous. These illuminated manuscripts were incredibly valuable, not just as physical objects, but as repositories of knowledge, art, and faith. The images and words on the page would have conveyed sacred messages, and the very act of creating these books was, for many, an act of devotion. The result was something that not only preserved knowledge, but elevated it. Historians still debate how long it took for the codex to fully replace the scroll in Europe. Some argue that it wasn't until the 4th or 5th century that the codex became widespread, while others believe it happened even earlier. One thing is clear, however. The transition from scrolls to codices in the early medieval period forever changed how books were used, shared, and read. And with that change came a shift in the very soundscape of books. Instead of long ceremonial recitations of epic poems or legal texts, we now had private, personal experiences of reading, with the gentle turning of parchment pages and the quiet scratching of quills. This shift also marked the beginning of a new era in which books became more accessible, not to the general public just yet, but to the growing network of scholars, priests, and nobility. Soon, books would no longer be confined to the temples, the royal courts, or the scribble workshops. The codex, with its new design, began to pave the way for books to become more portable, more personal, and more widespread. The sounds of these early codices, quill scratching, parchment turning, weren't just the sounds of a physical book being created. They were the sounds of knowledge becoming more accessible, of the written word evolving from something rare and sacred into something more practical, more usable, and more widespread. The book was becoming a tool for the masses, and with that shift came a revolution in how knowledge was shared and preserved. The impact of these early codices was monumental, and their sounds, both humble and profound, were the soundtrack to a new era of intellectual history. Now, let's fast forward just a bit further in time, entering the dawn of an era that would change everything, the printing revolution. Picture the early 15th century when the world of books was still a rarefied domain, locked behind the walls of monasteries or royal libraries. But the winds of change were blowing in Germany. Enter Johannes Gutenberg, the man who would forever alter the landscape of knowledge, learning and communication. The year is 1450, and Gutenberg is toiling away in his workshop, surrounded by what must have been a strange cacophony of sounds: metal clinking, the turning of gears, the soft murmur of voices in conversation, and most importantly, the mechanical thud of a press. Imagine the vibrations that ran through the workshop as the printing press began to churn out pages of text, one after another, at an unprecedented speed. The sounds of the medieval manuscript world were slowly being replaced with the rhythmic, mechanical noise of the printing press. The invention of movable type revolutionized the world of books, moving them from painstakingly handwritten manuscripts to mass-produced printed works. The press itself was a marvel of engineering for its time. It was capable of printing pages in large numbers, quickly and efficiently. The very sound of this new way of creating books was unlike anything the world had ever heard before. Gone were the days of scribes laboriously copying each letter by hand. Instead, there was the sound of ink being pressed onto paper, the scrape of type being assembled, and the steady clicking of the printing press as it made its mark on the page. Imagine standing in the press room as one page after another emerges from the machine, each sheet covered in neat, crisp text. It's a mechanical rhythm, fast and furious, and yet it's incredibly deliberate. Each page is created with precision, every word set in place by movable type, a system so ingenious that it would change the world forever. But the sounds of Gutenberg's press were more than just mechanical. They signified something far grander: the democratization of knowledge. Imagine what this would have meant for the world in 1450. Books, once precious and scarce, were now suddenly within reach of a much wider audience. The concept of reading, once a solitary activity reserved for the elite, began to spread. No longer would only the rich or religious orders have access to texts. The printing press opened up a whole new world of literature, science, law, and education to the masses. Can you hear it now? The buzz of excitement in small towns as people open their first printed book, the crisp sound of turning pages, the unfolding world of knowledge now accessible in their hands. This wasn't just a new technology, it was a cultural shift. The sound of a printed book turning was now the sound of the future. And as the printing press began to churn out books faster and more efficiently, it also allowed for a greater variety of content. No longer were books restricted to religious texts or legal codes. Suddenly there was room for novels, pamphlets, political tracts, and scientific treatises. The very content of books began to diversify, and with that diversity came the sound of new ideas entering the public sphere. The pages weren't just filled with religious doctrine or law. Now you could hear the philosophical debates, political arguments, and scientific revelations that were taking place. The Reformation itself was fueled in part by the printed word, with Martin Luther's 95 Theses rapidly disseminated throughout Europe. The voices of reformers, thinkers, and revolutionaries were amplified as their words spread far and wide, from one printing press to another. The printed word became a vehicle for change, stirring up dialogue, dissent, and innovation. In fact, the impact of the printing press on literacy was immediate and profound. As books became cheaper and more accessible, literacy rates soared. Where once only the elite could afford to read, now the average person could get their hands on a book, and with it, the chance to engage with new ideas, stories, and scientific discoveries. Imagine the sounds of a bustling town square, where booksellers peddle their wares, newspapers, pamphlets, the latest work by a philosopher, and the faint murmur of conversations filled with the excitement of new knowledge. People could now engage in debates that were previously reserved for the educated elite. This was the beginning of the modern public sphere, a space where ideas could be shared freely and without restriction. Historians continue to debate the exact impact of Gutenberg's press, but one thing is undeniable: it was the spark that ignited the fire of the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the scientific revolution. These were movements fueled by the power of the written word, which could now be produced and disseminated on a scale never before seen. The printing press transformed books from rare, labour-intensive objects into products that could be mass-produced and consumed by anyone with the ability to read. This democratization of knowledge didn't just change how people read, it changed how they thought. It gave them access to new worlds, new ideas, and new possibilities. And yet, even as the world of books was revolutionized, the soundscape of the written word began to shift once again. The printed book, unlike its ancient predecessors, was something that could be experienced quietly and privately. The public recitations of Homer's epics or the legal readings of the 12 Tables gave way to solitary, personal reading experiences. The sound of books transformed from the collective murmur of public readings to the soft rustle of pages being turned in the privacy of one's home. No longer did books need to be read aloud in public forums. Now, they could be experienced in the silence of one's own mind, making reading a personal, intimate activity. But that doesn't mean the world of books became quieter. Instead, the sound of the written word became internal, reverberating in the minds of readers as they engaged with the content. The words were no longer just heard in the air, they were heard in the reader's imagination, sparking a new kind of engagement with the material. So, when you think of the sound of a book today, the rustling pages, the whisper of a turn, the thump of a hardcover opening, is the echo of that revolutionary moment when books went from being the rarefied domain of the few to being accessible to the many. The printing press didn't just change books, it changed the world. And as we listen to the sound of pages turning today, we're hearing the continuation of a story that began in those early days, when the first sounds of books were born. We've come a long way, haven't we? From the scratch of a reed on clay to the rhythmic churning of the printing press, we've heard the evolution of books in all their various forms. But let's pause here for a moment and think about the role of the book itself in the lives of ordinary people. By the late medieval and early Renaissance periods, books were becoming increasingly accessible, not just to royalty or clergy, but to educated individuals across Europe. It was a golden age of literacy, and with it came new forms of books that began to shift not just their format, but how they were used and experienced. But hold on, this wasn't just a change in material or structure. It was a change in how we engaged with the written word itself. Imagine walking into one of the first public libraries of the Renaissance. The shelves are lined with freshly printed tomes, works by scholars like Galileo, Copernicus, and Erasmus, as well as translations of the great texts of antiquity. The sound of these early books being browsed is a sharp contrast to the scrolls of ancient Greece and Rome, or the cuneiform tablets of Mesopotamia. Instead of a quiet, static environment filled with scribes copying texts by hand, you now have the subtle rustle of pages being turned, the sound of quiet discussion as readers flip through volumes and make notes in the margins. There's the murmur of learning in the air, the first time knowledge was truly accessible to a wider public. People no longer had to rely on oral tradition or private libraries. Public libraries became intellectual hubs, the birthplace of the free exchange of ideas, and the sounds in these spaces began to embody that shift. The turning of pages became the soundtrack to the blossoming of the intellectual world. These new books, printed in mass quantities, didn't just change who had access to knowledge, they changed how knowledge was consumed. Unlike the scrolls that required readers to unwind and re-roll, or the time-consuming handwritten manuscripts, these printed books were more portable, more compact, and more immediately accessible. People could now carry a book with them, whether it was a scientific treatise, a novel, or a religious text, and engage with it on their own terms. The intimacy of the printed book allowed for private reflection, quiet study, and personal interpretation. As a reader, you weren't just absorbing knowledge, you were experiencing it, turning pages with the rhythm of your own thoughts and reactions. The sound of the page turning became more than just a mechanical act. It was a part of how you connected with the material. Every page that turned meant you were moving further into the world contained within that book, and with it, the possibilities of learning, discovery, and reflection. The Renaissance, with its explosion of printing and book production, was not just a visual revolution, it was an auditory one too. It was the moment when books moved from the silent contemplation of individual scholars to a shared experience of intellectual exchange. Imagine standing in one of those early libraries hearing not just the rustle of pages, but the low murmur of voices as the world of ideas came alive in new and exciting ways. Books were now being read in a variety of languages, Latin for the scholars, but also the vernacular languages, making them accessible to a broader audience. The very sound of knowledge was now diverse, reflecting the varied intellectual currents of the time. It was no longer a world where books were reserved for the few. Now the sound of books reverberated throughout society, from the lecture halls of universities to the homes of curious, learned individuals. Historians still debate whether the Renaissance period marked a true shift in how people read and interpreted books. Were they still just passive receivers of information, or did this explosion of knowledge encourage a more interactive, questioning relationship with the material? Some suggest that while books became more accessible, the mass literacy that the printing press promised did not necessarily create a society of fully engaged readers. Instead, many were still just absorbing information, rather than questioning and challenging it. But regardless of how people engaged with these books, the sound of books was forever changed. The Renaissance marked the beginning of a new era where books were no longer just objects of the elite, but shared experiences, objects that could be held, turned, and read by anyone who could access them. What was revolutionary about the sounds of Renaissance books wasn't just the mechanics of the page turning, though. It was the idea that books were becoming a central part of people's daily lives. They were no longer merely ceremonial objects for the ruling class. They were tools for thinking, for self-exploration, and for public discourse. The act of reading was no longer confined to quiet contemplation in the study of a wealthy individual. Now, books could be read in homes, in public spaces, in marketplaces, and in the church. The sound of books became part of the fabric of daily life, from the turning of a page in a quiet corner to the recitation of a passage in a bustling town square. This cultural shift in the use and accessibility of books eventually laid the groundwork for the Enlightenment, a period in which reason and inquiry began to replace tradition and superstition. Books became more than just repositories of knowledge. They became vehicles for change, for reform, and for a new way of thinking about the world. And just as important, they became the vessels through which that new way of thinking was heard by a wider audience. It wasn't just the words themselves that were powerful. It was the shared experience of reading, hearing, and thinking that made books so transformative. The sound of the page turning, the rhythm of engagement, became the rhythm of intellectual progress. By the time the Enlightenment arrived, books were no longer simply tools for preserving knowledge. They were dynamic agents of change. The sounds of books, rustling pages, quiet discussions, the reading of ideas aloud, became synonymous with the advancement of human thought. And that tradition continues to this day. As books become digital and audio, the act of experiencing the written word continues to evolve, but the essence of sharing ideas and sparking new thoughts remains unchanged. As we journey deeper into the evolution of books, let's now step into the industrial age, a time when the sound of books would change once again, this time through the hum of machines. It's the late 18th century, and we're in the midst of the Industrial Revolution, a period of radical technological change. Imagine the clatter of gears, the rhythm of machines pounding away in factories, and the loud, bustling energy of industry. And in the midst of all this noise, something transformative is happening, the rise of mass production. Books are no longer a luxury reserved for the wealthy or the elite. They are beginning to be produced on a scale that allows for wider access. Enter the world of the printing press, not the manual presses of Gutenberg, but large, steam-powered printing presses capable of cranking out thousands of books a day. This new, mechanical way of printing would forever change the book industry, making books more affordable and accessible to the general public. Picture yourself standing in the heart of a bustling print shop. The sounds are unlike anything we've heard before. Pounding metal, the churn of gears, the sound of large rollers pushing paper through the press with machine-like precision. The books of this new age are not created by hand anymore, but by mechanical presses that create page after page at lightning speed. The rhythmic thud-thud of the press becoming a steady background hum as the pages stack up in neat piles. The machines hum with efficiency, cranking out books in large quantities, and this sound of mass production would soon become the defining sound of the book industry. The sound of a printing press was no longer just the scratch of a quill on parchment. It was the heartbeat of a new age, one that was marked by rapid progress, increased illiteracy, and a newfound democratization of knowledge. But the significance of this shift goes far beyond just the increased availability of books. The Industrial Revolution allowed for a profound shift in how books were consumed and shared. The spread of printed material allowed for the rapid dissemination of ideas. Imagine the sound of the first pamphlets or newspapers being read aloud in crowded markets, as people gathered to hear the latest political news, scientific discoveries, or cultural critiques. Books were no longer just for the privileged few. Now, even the working class could afford to buy books. The Industrial Revolution marked the beginning of the public book. Books for the masses, not just the elite. But what did this mean for the experience of books? The public could now read more than ever before, but the sound of books had evolved in ways that we may not fully appreciate today. No longer was reading solely a personal, intimate act. Books were beginning to be read aloud in public places. Books, newspapers, and pamphlets that were the product of mass production were shared among people, discussed in cafes, in town squares, and in workers' halls. It's easy to imagine the sound of the bustling market square, filled with the excited chatter of people discussing the latest political treatise or scientific theory, their voices rising and falling with the words they had read from the latest printed book. The experience of books was no longer a quiet, solitary one. Instead, it had become part of the public conversation, the cultural exchange of ideas that characterized this period of societal transformation. The transition from handmade to machine-made books didn't just affect who had access to books. It changed the way we read. Imagine picking up a book in the 19th century. Instead of a carefully illuminated manuscript or a hand-copied scroll, you're holding something that looks almost like what we have today. Bound pages with neat, uniform printing on each. The pages are easy to turn, the text crisp and consistent. For the first time, the book became an object that anyone could handle, share, and enjoy. And the tactile experience of holding a book was still present, but now it was combined with the efficiency of mass production. This was a shift from books as sacred, rare artifacts to books as everyday objects, available to all. Historians still debate whether this shift toward mass production of books in the Industrial Revolution created a more thoughtful, reflective reader, or if it merely increased the speed at which people consumed information. Some argue that the flood of easily accessible literature may have led to more shallow reading, quick consumption, without deep reflection. Others suggest that this mass availability of books led to a more literate and informed populace, giving rise to the cultural and intellectual movements that followed, such as the rise of public education and the spread of revolutionary ideas. Either way, the Industrial Revolution made books everyday objects, something you could walk into a shop and buy without thinking twice. The sound of books was no longer confined to the library or the study. It was filling the streets, the shops, and the homes of people everywhere. As the printing press churned out book after book, page after page, something else was happening in the world of literature. Writers and thinkers began to produce works for the masses, engaging with the common reader in ways that had never happened before. The French Revolution, for example, was fueled by pamphlets, political treatises, and revolutionary ideas that spread rapidly through printed material. The sound of revolution was, in many ways, the sound of books being produced and consumed on an unprecedented scale. The streets were alive with the rustling of paper, the turning of pages, and the passionate readings of manifestos and political works that inspired a generation to change the world. Even as the machines hummed and the books piled up, there was still a sense of reverence surrounding the book itself. Yes, books were now being produced quickly and cheaply, but they still carried a certain weight, an intellectual and cultural weight that transcended their physical form. The mass production of books during the Industrial Revolution gave rise to a new relationship between people and knowledge. It allowed for the spread of ideas, the fostering of intellectual growth, and the establishment of a truly literate society. The sound of books, the rustling of pages, the click of the binding, the hum of the printing press, was the sound of a new world being born, one where knowledge was no longer locked away in the hands of the few, but was being freely exchanged among the many. As we look at the sounds of books in the industrial age, it's impossible to ignore the rise of the public library, a place that would forever change how books were consumed, not just as objects, but as communal experiences. Now, Imagine walking into a grand public library at the dawn of the 19th century. The shelves are lined with a mix of old and new books, from legal codes to novels, scientific papers to poetry collections. The soundscape of the library is different from that of the bustling press rooms of the Industrial Revolution. Here, the primary noise is the soft rustle of pages being turned, the occasional whisper of readers discussing a book, and the quiet footsteps of library staff checking in and out books. The sound of knowledge in this space is intimate, contemplative, and reflective, a far cry from the noisy mechanical process of printing books. The library, unlike the press, was a place for quiet absorption, for private exploration of ideas, yet it played a role just as crucial in the expansion of literacy and education. In this new world of books, libraries became the repositories of collective knowledge, not just for the elite, but for the general public. The sound of the library, the flipping of pages, the hushed voices of readers, was the heartbeat of an evolving society. People from all walks of life could now borrow books, read without the expense of buying them, and engage with a wide range of material. The library was a democratizing force. The sounds of the pages turning represented the spread of knowledge not just through the pages of books, but also through the minds of the people who came to these spaces to learn and discover. The physicality of the library is essential here. Imagine walking through a marble or wood-panelled reading room. The distant murmur of voices in the air, the occasional squeak of a chair as someone shifts. The library, by design, wasn't just a place for books. It was a space for learning and growth, an environment where the sound of a turning page was intertwined with the process of intellectual development. The library was a sanctuary, a place where the public could escape the noise of the outside world and immerse themselves in a quiet, reflective experience. There was no rush here, no clanging of machines or shouting of street vendors. In the library, the sound was that of focused, solitary engagement. The rise of public libraries coincided with a period of intense social change. Books were now not just for scholars, but for the common man and woman. The Industrial Revolution had created a new social order, one where education and literacy were becoming more common, and the barriers between the social classes were slowly beginning to erode. Libraries became important pillars of the social fabric. They weren't just places for reading, they were spaces for community engagement. In the libraries of major cities, the sounds of discussion, debate, and shared learning were a vital part of the intellectual culture of the time. But let's not forget the physicality of books during this period. The printed book was still bound by the hands of craftspeople, who carefully sewed each page together to create a durable, readable artifact. The sound of binding, the snapping of thread, the clinking of metal tools, and the quiet rustle of parchment being stitched together was a far cry from the industrialized sounds of the printing press. It was in the intimate binding process that the final form of the book was truly created, no longer just a mass-produced object, but a vessel for knowledge shaped by the hands of skilled artisans. The act of binding, which had once been the exclusive domain of wealthy scribes, was now a democratized process, ensuring that books were made available to as many people as possible. This shift in how books were produced, distributed, and consumed was not just an industrial revolution, it was a cultural one. With the rise of public libraries and affordable printing came the spread of literacy on a larger scale than ever before. The sounds of pages turning, the quiet murmur of public discussions, and the rustle of books being passed from hand to hand marked the beginning of a new era in human history. Books were no longer the sole domain of the wealthy or the religious elite. They were becoming available to everyone, from factory workers to intellectuals, from the poor to the middle class. The sound of the pages turning in a library was now the sound of social progress, as the written word spread its roots into every corner of society. And with the spread of books came the spread of new ideas, ideas that challenged old power structures, that questioned tradition, and that sparked revolutions. The library, with its endless shelves of books, became a symbol of intellectual freedom. The sounds in these spaces weren't just about reading. They were about the exchange of ideas, the challenge of old norms, and the sharing of new visions for the future. Just as books had once been used to preserve religious teachings and royal decrees, now they were used to question and critique those very ideas. The rise of the public library marked a turning point in how books were perceived. They weren't just things to be revered. They were tools for change, for growth, and for a more inclusive society. Historians continue to debate the exact role of the library in fostering intellectual and political movements. Some argue that libraries, by offering easy access to knowledge, were key in the spread of democratic ideals. Others suggest that the rise of the library was just one part of a much larger social and political shift, where literacy and intellectual engagement played a central role. Either way, the soundscape of the library was a reflection of a society that was changing, no longer just preserving the past but looking to the future. The sound of pages turning in those early public libraries was a sound of empowerment, of liberation, and of the collective potential of knowledge. As we move further into the 19th century, the world of books enters a new phase of its evolution, one marked not just by the quiet turning of pages or the mechanical hum of printing presses, but by the democratization of reading. This shift wasn't just a result of cheaper production techniques or the proliferation of public libraries. It was also tied to the rise of a new kind of book, the novel. This new genre, though it had roots in earlier traditions of storytelling, was able to flourish in an era where books could be produced cheaply and widely circulated. Imagine yourself in Victorian England or 19th century America. The hum of industrial machines, the clatter of trains on the tracks, and the rustle of countless pages being turned. These sounds would become familiar in the lives of millions as the novel became one of the most popular and influential forms of literature in the modern world. But novels weren't just printed and sold in bookstores, they were serialized. You could hear the buzz of excitement each week as new chapters of the latest serialized story were released in newspapers and magazines. This was a time when novels were consumed almost like a weekly TV show, with readers eagerly awaiting the next installment of their favourite stories. Imagine the sound of the newspaper hitting your doorstep early in the morning, the pages unfolding to reveal the latest chapter of a story that had been gripping the public's imagination. You could almost hear the collective sigh of anticipation as readers devoured the words, each turn of the page bringing them closer to the conclusion of the story. And these weren't just any stories. The novels of this era tackled serious social, political and moral issues. They were a mirror reflecting the rapidly changing world of the 19th century. As books, especially novels, became more widely available, they began to serve not only as entertainment, but as a way to reflect society's values, hopes and anxieties. The novel became a form of social commentary, a way for writers to critique the world around them, whether it was the harsh realities of industrialization, the injustices of slavery, or the struggles of the working class. Authors like Charles Dickens, Harriet Beecher Stowe, and Leo Tolstoy used their novels to shine a light on the inequalities and moral dilemmas of their time, and their words were amplified by the sounds of the press, loud, rhythmic and steady, producing books that would go on to change the world. The sound of a book being read aloud, whether in a public space, a family home or a tavern, became the sound of public discourse, of social change. The widespread availability of novels wasn't just a cultural shift, it was also an economic one. By the mid-19th century, reading had become more than just an intellectual pursuit for the elite. It had become a mass-market activity. Books became affordable commodities, no longer restricted to the rich or the well-educated. The rise of the novel coincided with a greater democratization of knowledge. Now, not just scholars or aristocrats, but factory workers, housemaids, and children could experience the written word. Books became a staple of daily life. Imagine the hum of a busy factory floor, where the workers might be talking about the latest chapter of a serial novel, or the quiet murmur of a family gathered around the hearth, reading aloud from the novel that had just arrived from the publisher. The sounds of books now filled the home, the workplace and the public space. Books weren't just for the wealthy or the intellectual elite anymore. They were for everyone. But this explosion of literary culture also brought with it a new sound, the sound of the mass market. The production of books grew to meet demand, and the printing press was now not just creating books for the sake of knowledge but for profit. Publishers, authors and booksellers had realized that books were not just valuable cultural artifacts, they were also big business. And so the mass production of novels wasn't just about sharing stories, it was about reaching the widest possible audience. The sound of the printing press now had a certain rhythm to it, a steady cadence of production that mirrored the industrialization of society itself. The press became a machine not just for preserving knowledge, but for disseminating culture, and it did so on a scale previously unimaginable. But with this new mass-market approach came a shift in the very experience of reading. The novel, which had once been read aloud in small, intimate settings, became more of a solitary experience. The sounds that accompanied reading, the rustle of pages, the quiet turning of a book, became a private experience. You could no longer hear the collective hum of a group of readers sharing their excitement for the next chapter of a serialized story. Instead, reading was an individual pursuit. The sound of books began to change again, no longer communal and public, but deeply personal. The act of reading in the quiet of your home, the turning of pages, the soft murmur of the reader as they absorbed the world of the novel became a private escape, a way to connect with the characters, the themes, and the issues the book addressed. And yet, even as the act of reading became more solitary, it was still a vital part of a wider cultural conversation. People would discuss the latest novels in salons, in cafes, and in homes. The novels themselves became a reflection of society's greatest questions. Who are we as a people? What is our place in the world? What does it mean to be human? The sound of the pages turning in these novels wasn't just a physical action, it was a cultural experience, one that resonated far beyond the individual reader. Historians debate the lasting impact of the rise of the novel. Was it simply a new form of entertainment, or did it play a more fundamental role in shaping the intellectual landscape of the 19th and early 20th centuries? Some argue that novels became vehicles for social change, with their portrayal of real-world issues forcing society to confront uncomfortable truths. Others suggest that, while novels were undoubtedly influential, they were more about entertainment than about changing the world. Either way, one thing is clear. The sound of the novel, the rustle of pages turning, the hum of public discourse, and the quiet solitude of personal reading became the soundtrack to a new era in literature. Now, as we venture further into the 20th century, the sound of books begins to shift once again, influenced by the rise of new technologies. The printing press, with its mechanical hum, gave way to the age of mass-market publishing, but soon another revolution would change everything. Enter the world of the typewriter and the rise of the audiobook. Imagine the rapid clacking of typewriter keys, the rhythmic sound of each letter being struck, the click-clack of a machine that would forever alter how books were produced and consumed. As the industrial age faded and the modern age took over, the typewriter was one of the first symbols of a new way of creating and experiencing books, one that was faster, more efficient, and increasingly personal. The typewriter allowed authors to write their novels, short stories, and essays at a pace that was previously impossible. Imagine sitting at a typewriter for hours, the sound of the keys clacking rhythmically as the words form on the page, the click of the return lever as each line ends. This was a sound that echoed throughout offices, homes, and even publishing houses as writers cranked out manuscripts faster than ever before. No longer did authors have to rely on handwritten drafts. The typewriter allowed them to work more quickly and efficiently, speeding up the process of writing and editing. The sound of a typewriter became synonymous with productivity, and for many writers, it became a central part of their creative process. But the rise of the typewriter wasn't just about efficiency. It also transformed the role of the author. No longer did authors need to rely on scribes or secretaries to transcribe their words. With a typewriter, they could now control every aspect of their work. The sounds of the typewriter, click, clack, ding, return, became the soundtrack of modern writing. The pace of the typewriter was fast, but the process of creation was still intimate. Authors sat at their machines, crafting their stories and ideas, surrounded by the sounds of their thoughts taking shape on the page. The rhythm of the typewriter reflected the speed of the modern world. Fast, efficient, and ever-moving. But the story doesn't end there. As we move into the second half of the 20th century, the sound of books would change again, this time with the advent of the audiobook. The audiobook, once a niche market, began to find a larger audience, particularly in the 1980s and 1990s, as technology advanced. Now, the act of reading a book was no longer limited to the visual process of turning pages. You could now hear books, with the voices of professional narrators bringing the written word to life. Imagine driving down a highway, the sound of your car engine humming steadily, while in the background the voice of a narrator reads a novel to you. It's an entirely different experience than reading in silence, one that appeals to a different sense, one that invites you to engage with the story through sound rather than sight. The sound of an audiobook is its very essence, the voice of the narrator, the subtle pauses, the emphasis on certain words, the rise and fall of tone as the story unfolds. An audiobook is, in many ways, a performance. The narrator becomes the bridge between the author and the listener, interpreting the text and adding layers of emotion, rhythm and meaning to the story. Think of the way a narrator might change their voice for different characters, giving them distinct personalities, or the way they might build suspense with a well-timed pause or change in tone. The audiobook, unlike a printed book, is a communal experience of sorts, even when listened to in solitude. The sound of an audiobook is a performance in your ear, the story unfolding through someone else's voice, rather than your own internal dialogue. And just like the typewriter revolutionized the writing process, the audiobook revolutionized the reading experience. Books were no longer just something to be read with the eyes. They could be heard, experienced differently, and even absorbed while doing other tasks. Audiobooks made literature accessible in a new way, especially for people who had visual impairments, struggled with reading, or simply wanted to enjoy a book while doing chores, commuting, or exercising. The experience of hearing a book, whether it's a gripping thriller or a profound philosophical text, becomes its own kind of magic. The voice of the narrator brings a new layer of intimacy and connection to the story, creating an auditory experience that enhances the narrative in ways that written text alone cannot. But the audiobook is more than just a modern convenience. It represents a fundamental shift in the way books are consumed. It's the culmination of centuries of storytelling tradition, from the oral traditions of ancient cultures to the public readings in ancient Greece and Rome. The audiobook taps into the oldest form of sharing stories, the spoken word, while harnessing the power of modern technology. It's a hybrid of old and new, combining the power of the voice with the convenience of the modern world. And just as books were once spoken aloud in the town square, they're now shared through digital media, giving the spoken word a new life in the modern world. As we look to the future of books, we can't help but wonder where the next evolution will take us. Will audiobooks continue to dominate as more people turn to voice-activated technology and smart speakers? Will books become even more interactive, with sounds, visuals, and even immersive technologies like virtual reality taking the reading experience to a whole new level? The sound of books will undoubtedly continue to evolve, just as it has from the earliest cuneiform tablets to the printed page, from the typewriter to the audiobook. But no matter where it goes, one thing is clear. The experience of reading, of hearing the words come to life, will always be a central part of our cultural and intellectual experience. The sound of books, whether in the clattering of a typewriter, the rustle of pages turning, or the voice of a narrator, is the sound of human connection, and it will continue to echo through time as long as there are stories to be told. As we move through the evolution of books and their sounds, one cannot help but marvel at how technological advances have not only changed how books are created and consumed, but also how they are experienced. We've moved from the quiet, labour-intensive work of scribes and the mechanical hum of the printing press, to the gentle whir of digital devices that have revolutionised the way books are read. We are now living in the age of e-books, and with this shift comes a new set of sounds. The tap of fingers on a screen, the gentle swish of a page turning on a digital device, and perhaps the soft, ambient hum of a reader's surroundings as they engage with the text. The experience of reading a book has gone from an auditory one to a visual and tactile one, with the sound of the experience now existing in the background, almost unnoticed, as we engage with our digital devices. The rise of ebooks is perhaps the most dramatic shift in the history of books. The physicality of the book, its weight, its pages, its cover, has been replaced by something entirely intangible. Instead of flipping through the pages of a hardcover or paperback, readers now swipe or tap to move through the text. The sound of reading is different now. There is no rustling of paper, no satisfying crunch of a page turning. Instead, there is the soft click of a screen as a new page appears in front of you, and perhaps the faint tapping of fingers on glass. The experience is quieter, more solitary, and far more portable than ever before. You can carry entire libraries in the palm of your hand, your tablet or e-reader, containing hundreds, if not thousands, of books at once. The digital book has become the ultimate convenience, and its soundscape reflects that. But while the experience has become more convenient, it has also become more distant. The physical connection to the book, the act of turning a page, the weight of the book in your hands, has been replaced by a digital interface. the sound of a book being read has evolved from a communal, public performance to something much more solitary and personal. The act of reading on an e-reader or tablet is a quiet individual experience. It's an experience that takes place not in the public sphere, but in the solitude of your own space. Perhaps the only sound you hear is the occasional tap of your fingers, or the faint ding of a notification. Reading has become an intimate personal act once again, but this time it's surrounded by the ambient noises of modern life, traffic, office chatter, or the hum of a coffee shop. The rise of ebooks also raises interesting questions about the future of the book as a physical object. With the digital revolution, books are no longer limited to their physical form. Instead, they can be stored, accessed, and read on a wide variety of devices. The idea of a book has changed dramatically in the digital age. The sounds associated with traditional books, pages turning, the rustling of paper, the clink of a binding, have faded into the background. Today, books are experienced as digital files, displayed on a screen and accessed with the tap of a finger. And yet, this shift doesn't diminish the impact of the words themselves. The content, the stories remain just as powerful. What's changed is how we interact with them. Historians still debate whether the rise of digital books has a negative impact on our reading habits. Some suggest that the ease and convenience of ebooks might discourage deep reading, while others argue that the sheer availability of books and the ability to access them instantly might encourage a new generation of readers. Some even worry that the constant presence of screens in our lives might reduce our attention span, but others see it as an opportunity to expand how we engage with text. With features like adjustable fonts, text-to-speech, and built-in dictionaries, ebooks have made reading more accessible than ever before, especially for people with disabilities or learning differences. The sounds of books may have changed, but the experience of engaging with the written word has only become more flexible, dynamic, and personalised. And as we move further into the future, the sound of books may continue to evolve in ways we can only begin to imagine. With virtual reality, VR, and augmented reality, AR, technologies on the horizon, books could soon become fully immersive experiences. Imagine putting on a VR headset and being transported into the world of a novel, where you can hear the sounds of the environment around you, engage with the characters in real time, and interact with the story as it unfolds. The possibilities are endless, and the sounds of books will only continue to evolve as technology advances. The digital age has not just changed how books are consumed, it's changing how we experience stories altogether. Yet, even with all the technological advancements and the new sounds of books, there's something timeless about the experience of reading a physical book. The gentle sound of a page turning, the scent of ink and paper, the weight of a hardcover, these sensory experiences are deeply ingrained in our understanding of what a book is. The rise of ebooks and digital platforms might change the way we read, but the essence of what makes a book powerful, its ability to transport us, to make us think, to evoke emotion, remains unchanged. Whether it's a digital screen or the pages of a leather-bound tome, the sound of a book will always be intertwined with the experience of reading itself. In the end, the sound of books, from the ancient rustle of papyrus scrolls to the tap of a digital screen, is a testament to the enduring power of the written word. The way we experience books has evolved, but the journey of knowledge, imagination, and discovery remains constant. The sound of books will continue to change with the times, but the magic they carry, whether read aloud in ancient forums, whispered in libraries, or experienced through immersive virtual worlds, will always be a part of our collective human experience. As we sit here in the 21st century, watching the digital age unfold before us, it's clear that the world of books and their sounds is still in transition. The rise of ebooks, audiobooks, and other digital formats has transformed how we experience literature. But there is one sound that continues to endure through it all, the sound of a book being shared. Whether it's an audiobook being played aloud for a group to hear, a teacher reading from a printed textbook in a classroom, or even a group of friends discussing their latest reads in a cafe, the shared experience of a book continues to resonate across time. In the age of digital media, books are no longer simply individual solitary objects. They've become a part of the collective experience once again. Thanks to digital platforms, book clubs have surged in popularity, online forums are brimming with discussions, and social media allows readers to share their thoughts instantly with a global community. The sound of books has become a conversation once more, but this time It's happening on a global scale. The instantaneous sharing of ideas, the recommendations, and the lively debates about plot twists and character arcs are all a part of the soundscape of modern books. In a sense, books have come full circle, no longer the private, personal reading experience of the past. They've become part of the public discourse again, just as they were in ancient Greece or Rome, when philosophers and poets read aloud to their audiences. But there's a new dimension to the shared experience of books in the digital age. Think about the rise of book podcasts, where listeners can hear an entire novel dissected, analysed and discussed in vivid detail. Imagine the voices of multiple narrators weaving in and out, creating a dynamic and immersive auditory experience. The sound of books, once confined to printed pages and audiobooks, has now found its way into yet another realm, audio storytelling. Whether it's a deep dive into a favourite novel or a casual chat about the latest bestseller, podcasts are allowing books to reach us in a way that's both intimate and communal. The sounds of these digital book discussions are filling our lives in ways we never imagined. It's not just about reading anymore, it's about hearing the story, hearing the analysis, and hearing the diverse perspectives of readers from all walks of life. And yet, even as the world of books expands, it's impossible to ignore the nostalgia for the traditional book experience. The physical act of holding a book, turning the pages, and immersing oneself in the tactile sensation of reading still holds a special place for many people. The sound of the page turning, the scent of ink and paper, the weight of a hardcover book in your hands. It's a sensory experience that digital books simply can't replicate. There's a certain intimacy and comfort in that physicality in the connection between reader and text. And while digital platforms have made books more accessible, the analogue experience of reading remains a cherished ritual for many. For some, the smell of a new book is a sensory trigger that brings back memories of their first foray into reading, or the joy of discovering a new favourite author. For others, the crisp sound of a page turning, the slight creak of the binding as a book is opened for the first time, evokes a sense of wonder and excitement that can only be found in the physical act of reading. In this sense, the sound of books has become more than just a function of reading. It has become a part of our cultural memory, a reminder of the way stories have been passed down through the ages. But the world of books is not static, and neither is the soundscape of reading. As technology continues to evolve, we're likely to see new innovations that continue to reshape how we interact with books. Could we one day have books that engage multiple senses beyond just sight and sound? Imagine a book that combines sound, touch, and even smell to create a fully immersive experience. The possibilities are endless, and the sound of books will likely continue to evolve alongside technological advancements, making reading an even more multisensory experience than ever before. And yet, despite all these changes, one thing remains constant. Books continue to be a bridge between individuals and the world. Whether they are printed on paper or displayed on a screen, the sound of books is still the sound of human connection, whether through the quiet solitude of reading or the collective conversations that now surround the world of literature. Books may evolve in form, but their impact on culture, society, and our shared experience will never diminish. The sound of a book being opened today, whether it's the rustle of a page, the click of a digital screen, or the voice of an audiobook narrator, is a sound that carries centuries of history within it. It is the echo of human creativity, the reflection of a society's values and aspirations, and the shared experience of a world that continues to read, to listen, and to learn from the past. In this way, the sound of books is timeless, transcending the centuries and adapting to the changing technologies that shape our world. Now, as we look ahead to the future of books, we find ourselves standing at the crossroads of the physical and digital worlds. These sounds of books have evolved from the slow scratching of cuneiform on clay to the mechanical hum of printing presses, from the soft rustle of papyrus scrolls to the click of digital pages turning. And yet, in the not-too-distant future, the way we experience books may change in ways we can't yet fully imagine. One of the most exciting possibilities on the horizon is the integration of virtual reality, VR, and augmented reality, AR, into the book reading experience. Imagine stepping into the world of a novel, not just reading it, but experiencing it in a fully immersive environment. You put on a VR headset and suddenly, you're no longer sitting on your couch reading a book. Instead, you're standing in the middle of a bustling medieval marketplace, surrounded by the sights and sounds of an ancient city. The smell of fresh bread baking wafts through the air, and the sound of a blacksmith's hammer striking metal rings in your ears. The characters you're reading about step out of the pages and become real, talking to you, moving around you, engaging with you as if they were truly alive. This is the future of books, the multi-sensory experience of literature. In a VR or AR environment, the sound of a book will no longer be just the turning of pages or the voice of a narrator. It will be the sound of a whole world unfolding around you. The rustling of leaves in a forest, the clinking of armour as a knight prepares for battle, the hum of a futuristic city in a science fiction novel. All of these sounds could be brought to life in ways we've never experienced before. The integration of VR and AR technologies into reading is an exciting prospect because it allows for a deeper connection between the reader and the text. No longer confined to just imagining the world in their minds, readers could step directly into the stories they love. They could interact with the characters, make decisions that affect the plot, and explore every corner of the world the author has created. This new frontier of reading will turn books into fully immersive interactive experiences that blur the lines between storytelling and gaming, between fiction and reality. Historians and futurists alike are still debating how this technology will shape the future of literature. Will these new, immersive experiences overshadow the traditional book? Will they render the act of reading on paper obsolete? It's hard to say, but one thing is certain. The future of books will likely involve a much more active experience. Instead of simply passively reading a book, the reader will be an active participant in the story, influencing how it unfolds and interacting with the environment in a way that makes reading more dynamic and engaging. The sound of a book will no longer just be confined to the words themselves. It will be the entire sensory experience of being inside the world the author has created. But it's not just VR and AR that are transforming the way we experience books. Advances in artificial intelligence, AI, are opening up new possibilities as well. Imagine an AI that adapts the story as you read it, creating personalized experiences for every reader. The characters could change their dialogue based on your preferences, the plot could take unexpected twists depending on your choices, and the tone of the story could shift to match your emotional state as you interact with it. The sound of a book in this future might not just be the narrator's voice, but a dynamic, evolving soundscape that adapts in real time to the reader's choices and engagement. In the world of AI-driven books, the concept of authorship could also shift dramatically. Instead of a single author crafting a static narrative, multiple authors, or even AI systems, could collaborate to create personalized interactive stories. The lines between writer, reader, and character would blur, and the act of storytelling could become a truly collaborative experience. The sound of books in this world would be as much about the interaction between reader and AI as it would be about the story itself. The potential of these new technologies to reshape the book experience is incredible, but it also raises important questions about the future of books in the digital age. Will this new, immersive form of storytelling be accessible to everyone, or will it be restricted to those with the latest technology? Will these new forms of books create a deeper connection between readers and stories, or will they further isolate us, making reading an even more solitary activity? Will the sound of books remain as powerful a tool for social and intellectual engagement as it once was, or will the experience become even more personal and individual? While these questions remain unanswered, one thing is clear. The future of books will likely continue to evolve alongside technological advancements, offering new ways for us to interact with stories, to experience literature, and to connect with others through the written word. The sound of books will continue to evolve as well, moving from the pages of a printed book to the virtual landscapes of the future. The book in all its forms, whether physical, digital, or immersive, will continue to be a central part of human culture and communication. In the future, the sound of books may no longer be a simple rustling of pages or a soft click of a screen. It could be the sound of worlds unfolding, of characters breathing life into the words, of stories coming alive in ways we never thought possible. The future of books promises to be a multi-sensory, immersive experience, one that will continue to captivate and inspire readers for generations to come. As we look further into the future, the question arises, will the essence of the book itself change as the form evolves? Will the fundamental sound of a book, the one that connects us to generations of readers past, be lost to new technologies? Will the digital world of immersive books, audiobooks, and virtual reality reshape our connection to the written word in ways we can't yet predict? One thing is for certain: the sound of books will continue to change, adapt, and evolve in ways that will bring new experiences to the act of reading and storytelling. But there will always be something deeply human about the simple act of turning a page, of physically holding a book in your hands. Despite the rise of digital formats, there is an undeniable comfort in the tactile sensation of paper, the sound of a page turning, and the quiet, personal experience of reading a physical book. This connection to physical books may never be fully replaced, no matter how sophisticated virtual or digital books become. After all, books have been with humanity for thousands of years, first as clay tablets, then papyrus scrolls, later as printed pages, and now as digital files. Through all these transformations, the essence of books as a means of transmitting stories, ideas, and knowledge remains constant. It's that continuity, the way books are passed down, shared, and experienced, that gives them a special place in our lives. In a way, the future of books may see a blending of both worlds, digital and physical, immersive and introspective. Think about the potential for hybrid books, books that can be both read in the traditional sense and experienced in virtual spaces. Imagine a print book that comes with an augmented reality AR component, where you can scan the pages with your phone to reveal extra content, animations, or even voice narration. The tactile experience of turning a page would remain, but the sound of the book could be enhanced with sound effects, music, and dialogue from characters that come to life in the AR space. The physicality of the book would continue to offer the comfort of familiarity, but the digital world could add an extra layer of depth to the reading experience. This merging of physical and digital could represent the future of books, a future where we get the best of both worlds. We've already seen this shift happen in some ways, with audiobooks and ebooks becoming major players in the literary world. But as technology continues to evolve, we can only imagine the ways books might be experienced in the future. What if books could adapt to the reader's mood or change based on the time of day? With the rise of artificial intelligence and smart technology, it's not impossible to imagine a future where a book could be personalized to fit the emotional state of the reader. The sound of a book could change depending on how the reader feels, or even become interactive, allowing the reader to choose their own narrative path. Much like the way some video games offer branching storylines, the future of books could offer endless possibilities for personalized, immersive experiences. The potential for interactive books is particularly exciting. Imagine a book that is no longer linear, where you can choose how the story unfolds based on decisions you make as the reader. The narrative could change direction depending on your choices, creating a truly dynamic experience. The soundscape of this kind of book could be just as interactive. Imagine a book that plays background music that changes based on the mood of the scene, or a novel where you interact with characters, hearing their voices in real time and influencing the plot with your actions. This kind of personalized, real-time experience would open up a new world of possibility for both readers and writers alike. But with all these advancements, it's important to consider what we stand to lose as well. As we move into an increasingly digital world, will the experience of reading a physical book, the sound of the page turning, the feel of the cover in your hand, the quiet solitude of reading in your favourite chair, become something of the past? Will books become so integrated into the digital world that their physical forms no longer hold the same value? There's something undeniably comforting about the ritual of reading a physical book. The world may become more connected digitally, but there's still a unique joy in the act of sitting down with a tangible book, hearing the rustle of paper, and becoming immersed in the world it creates. We may soon reach a point where the sound of books becomes more personalized than ever. Yet we shouldn't lose sight of the quiet, peaceful moments that physical books still offer. After all, it's the act of holding a book in your hands, the sensation of feeling the pages beneath your fingers, that creates an experience far different from scrolling on a screen. There is a subtle beauty in the tactile experience of a printed book, the slow turning of the page, the weight of it in your lap, the slight crackle of the spine as you open a new book for the first time. These small, almost imperceptible sounds are what make reading a physical book so satisfying. As digital technology continues to advance, we must also remember the cultural and emotional significance of physical books. Books have been passed down from generation to generation, shared between friends, and handed down as heirlooms, they carry with them not only the stories and knowledge of the past, but also a personal connection to the reader. The sound of a book being opened, whether it's the first page of a new novel or a well-loved favourite, will always carry a sense of anticipation, nostalgia, and excitement. No matter how books evolve, the sound of a book, whether printed or digital, will always evoke something deeply human. Looking ahead, we might also see books that are fully integrated into our daily lives in ways we never imagined. From interactive ebooks that combine video, sound, and text, to audiobooks that use artificial intelligence to change the way they're narrated based on the listener's preferences, the possibilities are endless. But regardless of how books evolve in the future, the act of reading will always remain a vital part of human culture. The sound of books, whether in the form of rustling pages, the click of a button, or the immersive experience of a fully interactive world, will continue to be the soundtrack to our shared human experience, an experience that links us to the past and propels us into the future. As we arrive at the final chapter of our journey through the history of books, we pause to reflect on everything we've experienced. The ancient scribes carving symbols into clay, the rhythmic hum of Gutenberg's press, the soft swish of a page turning in a library, the tap of fingers on a digital screen, and the immersive soundscapes of audiobooks. The sound of books, though it has evolved and adapted with every technological advancement, remains a constant thread throughout history, a reminder of the profound role books play in shaping human culture and intellectual life. But as we stand at the precipice of yet another transformation in the world of books, one driven by artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and other digital technologies, it's important to remember the core essence of what a book represents. A book is more than just a collection of words on paper or pixels on a screen. It is a gateway to knowledge, a portal to other worlds, a reflection of the human experience. And while the sounds of books may continue to change, the experience of reading will remain at the heart of what it means to be human. Perhaps one of the most striking things about the evolution of books is how, despite all the technological innovations, the act of reading remains fundamentally the same. Whether you're holding a leather-bound tome, listening to an audiobook on a long car ride, or reading a story in VR, the act of engaging with the written word, the way it captures our attention, ignites our imagination, and shapes our understanding of the world, hasn't changed. The sounds may have evolved, but the connection between reader and text, the way a book can transport us, inspire us, and challenge us, remains timeless. In the future, as books continue to merge with technology, it's possible that they will become even more integrated into our lives. We might read on screens built into our clothes or listen to stories directly through neural interfaces. We might interact with characters as if they're real, or step inside a story and walk among its characters, feeling the world come to life around us. But even in this new, futuristic world of storytelling, the essence of what makes a book, a way of sharing stories, ideas, and knowledge, will endure. The sounds may change, but the experience of being transported by a book will always remain a uniquely human experience. And even as books become more immersive and interactive, we should remember that the sound of a book isn't just about the physical noises it makes, it's about the feeling it evokes. Whether it's the rustle of a page turning, the hum of an audiobook narrator's voice, or the soft click of a screen as we scroll through text, the sound of books is a reflection of the connection we have with the stories they hold. The experience of reading is always personal, and yet it is also something shared across time and space. The stories we read are not just ours. They are part of a larger collective human narrative that spans centuries. In the end, the story of books is not just about how they're made, how they sound, or how we consume them. It's about what they give us: knowledge, inspiration, entertainment, and most importantly, a shared understanding of who we are as a species. As we continue to innovate and push the boundaries of what books can be, we must not lose sight of the fact that books are not just about technology. They're about us. They're about our stories, our ideas, and our collective journey as human beings. So, as we close this chapter, we leave with the sound of books still echoing in our minds. The rustling of pages, the click of a button, the voice of a narrator. These sounds will continue to evolve, but the power of books will remain. In every story, in every book, we are reminded of our shared humanity, and the sound of a book, no matter how it is experienced, will always carry with it the heartbeat of that timeless connection, 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 that